Thank you for including me in this really inspiring day. I know some of you are here for the public portion of the evening, but some of you were here throughout the day. And I have to say, it's just been marvelous to hear the ideas and conversational exchanges and questions and enthusiasm for seizing the moment that you find yourselves in here in New Zealand. When the CEO of Frameworks asked me if I was free to come to New Zealand in February, I thought it was a typo and that he really meant New Mexico or New York. And he said, no, I really mean New Zealand. And I said, yes, I will make myself free. So I said yes, and then I told my colleagues, New Zealand is 18 hours ahead of us. I didn't realize 18 hours ahead. So then they started teasing me about sending them a postcard from the future, which is funny. But then I came and I spent the day here, and now I really feel like I am seeing the future, that I am here in the future, because the work that you're doing in the months ahead, in the years ahead, really will inform the future, not just of New Zealand, but as an outsider coming here and hearing where you're at and the kinds of ideas you're exchanging, I really don't see why the work you're doing couldn't be a model for other countries around the world. If you achieve the very ambitious goals I heard discussed today, there's no reason that that the things you create here won't in fact become things that we can model, that we can adopt later in the future, and we can follow your lead. So I hope to make some small contribution to the effort today by sharing a bit about Frameworks and what we do, in the hope that it will help you in thinking about the change that you're creating. So I want to begin with this quote from sociologists Snow and Benford. The good news about windows of opportunity is that they occasionally open, and then the bad news is that they tend to shut too. So these sociologists, Snow and Benford, write that the failure of mass mobilization when structural conditions seem otherwise ripe may be accounted for by the absence of a resonant master frame. And that's what I want to talk with you about today. It's really what the Frameworks Institute does. We help social justice advocates and policy experts achieve a master story that can unite a field and shape public discourse, a story that's powerful enough to mobilize people on a large scale to achieve the kinds of real change, real and lasting change that you're working for. So we do this in lots of different places and with lots of different organizations and lots of different issues. And when I say this, what I mean in a nutshell is that we use social science to map the gaps between how experts and advocates like you think and talk about a social issue and how the public thinks and talks about that same social issue, so that we can then fill in those gaps to help the public think more like experts do. We fill in those gaps with communication strategies that we design and test to make sure that they actually improve people's expert understanding of an issue, because we know that if we can help the public think more like all of you do, experts and advocates and researchers working on an issue, then they'll be more likely to support the kinds of solutions that you know are needed to make that real and lasting change. We do this on a whole host of issues. There are a few examples up here. We're probably best known for our work with the Harvard University Center on the Developing Child, which is where we really started out about 20 years ago, working on translating the neuroscience of child development and brain development to help inform social policy in the US around children. We've worked in Canada to translate how child mental health works, as well as early childhood development and the science of addiction and substance use disorder. We've worked recently in Australia on parenting issues, and prior to that on early learning and care. We've done work in the UK on child maltreatment. So we've been in different places and have seen a lot of different groups of really earnest, enthusiastic people trying to figure out how can we further our agenda, how can we make real movement on the issues of the day. So I want to spend some time answering a couple of questions and then introducing you to 3 what I call framing fundamentals. The questions are, what is framing and why frame? And then I'll walk you through what it looks like to do the work of figuring out what a master story might look like. Let's start with what is framing. Very simply, framing is about making a set of choices about what to say, what to emphasize in your message, what not to say, for the purpose of shaping people's understanding of an issue. And Frameworks has identified 12 elements that go into making a message frame. So if you think about a picture frame as something that's composed of wood and glass and wire and glue, etc., a message frame is composed of component parts too, like what is the tone of your message and what effect does that have on your audience? Who's your messenger? What value appeal are you using? Are you presenting solutions? If you're using numbers, how are you using those numbers? And so on. The strength of your explanation. So that's what framing is, really briefly. We see framing all the time, happens around us all the time, and an important thing to remember is that frames are in competition with each other. So you're always in a battle to make the frame that you've chosen, your master story, the one that dominates public discourse. So in the Brexit, Leave, and Remain campaigns, they used very different framing strategies. The Leave campaign really framed the issue as one of national purity and this invasion by outsiders, which you can see in the image here. We're at the breaking point. The EU has failed us all. Okay, so a big message of fear. And then the Remain campaign used a different strategy. It was one that was really focused on the economic question. They framed it in terms of individual economics too. So you can see that there with the empty pockets. And we know how that turned out. So frames do battle in the public sphere, and having one that works is really critical to moving your agenda. So that's how it might work at a big level, but I want to pull it down to a small level and show you how framing can work on an individual. So let me give you an example of how the choices you make when you're communicating about a social issue understand how people how people understand the issue. I'll give you an example. What I'm about to play for you is a short video that offers 2 quick illustrations of how people's thinking can be shaped by the use of frames. What you're going to see are before and after videos. The first is on addiction and substance use in Canada, and then the second is a before and after video of someone talking about stress in children's lives. In the before clips, they're responding to some open-ended questions. And then before you get to the after clips, what's happened in the interim is that a researcher has shared with the individual a framing strategy that we are testing out on the streets. Okay, so then what I want you to do, and then when you hear the after portion, those people are responding to the same open-ended question. So what I want you to do is just listen for what you hear that changes in the before and the after. And just remember that what you hear is the effect of about a 15-word sentence that someone's been introduced to.
So somebody who's addicted to cigarettes chose to have those first few drags and rip the shit out of their throat and become addicted to cigarettes. Alcohol, they chose to have enough alcohol to end up addicted to it. As I said initially, leading to addiction is the susceptibility to addiction. And if you aren't exposed to it, and especially at sensitive times or at critical times, then you might not end up addicted.
So what do you think about stress?
It's a normal part of development, in my opinion.
What's the effect or the role of stress? Again, thinking about young kids.
That causes, in my opinion, long-term damage to a child. A lot of the emotional developments and the learnings that are meant to take place wouldn't happen in that situation.
So what did you notice in the before and after? Anything catch your eye or your ear? Sorry? You saw more empathy the second time around. Okay, great. More empathy, maybe better understanding of how someone might end up with a substance use problem. Anything else? Yes, the behaviors were contextualized in the after. So people then suddenly understood, oh, perhaps there are external social factors that contribute to outcomes in ways that weren't present in the before. One of the things that I note in the videos that I find is fascinating is the gentleman says, well, as I said initially, but that is not what he said initially. And then the woman says, in my opinion, both times. But the only thing that happened to change her opinion in the interim was the introduction of a metaphor, which I'll talk to you a little bit more about in just a second. So she didn't even realize that there was such a wild shift in her thinking, and neither did he. It was so natural, and the only thing that happened was that they were exposed to a different way of thinking about the issue that they had adopted just through that quick exposure to a framing strategy. Okay, so that's what framing is and what it looks like. But let's talk about why you would take the time. You're all very busy. You have a million other things to do, and now I'm just asking you to do one more thing and add one more thing to your plate. Well, if you take the time to change the frame with which you express the importance of the work that you do, the solutions that you're proposing, explaining what problems they solve, you can change the culture. And if you can change the culture, you can really open up the possibility of moving forward some of the social issues that you've been working on. This quote here from Ivan Illich really gets to the heart of what framing tries to accomplish. And it's really, I believe, true that the simple answer to the question why frame is because you really don't have a choice if your goal is to make change, which is something that I think everyone here shares as a goal from what I witnessed today. But the quote drives home the point that your job as change makers is to take what the public already believes to be inevitable or perhaps the way things should be and shift their thinking. So for example, the idea that poverty will always be with us, or that for some people, good outcomes will always be elusive, to change that, shift that perspective so that what has seemed just and unchangeable has come to be seen as unjust and changeable so that you can actually move the kinds of agenda items you want. And frames can make change. This is our theory of change. This is the operating theory that Frameworks uses in all of its work. And it goes like this. The idea is that if we frame, and if we do it in the right way, we can change our culture and shape our lived reality so it looks different than it does today. And we start by getting a field of practice, so the field of public health, the field of early childhood development, the field of criminal justice reform. You pick the field to start talking differently about the work that they do. And over time, that influences how public discourse happens. Those framing strategies get picked up, put into media discourse, and as more and more people are exposed to these other ways of thinking about an issue, that changes public thinking. And if you can change public thinking, you can change what kind of support you get for what kinds of policies. You can expand the options that are available to you. So I'm going to walk you through an example of how we've done that work in the US, and we've done that work significantly in Canada and are beginning to do it in other countries around the world too. Okay, so to take the example of early childhood development, we started working at the ECD field about 20 years ago, right around the time we were founded, to get them to adopt the framing strategies that we had tested in collaboration with the Harvard Center. So the researchers, we dragged them kind of kicking and screaming to publish journal articles using our framing strategies. And if you can imagine us in a room with neuroscientists saying, use this framing strategy, and they're saying, we're scientists, we don't use metaphors, but we got them to do it anyway. So they used things like the term toxic stress. If you've heard of that, we developed that to explain the concept of allostatic load. And just for example, we just developed a metaphor to explain early attachment, a tennis metaphor of serve and return, and so on. So we got them and other ECD experts and practitioners to use these things, more and more people followed suit. And over time, their communications really began to look and sound different. You can see that here as people started to adopt the strategies. We started seeing more and more literature that used our framing strategies like toxic stress. So as the field started communicating differently over time, those strategies started to filter into media discourse and shaping public discourse. That's by design, because the framing strategies that we develop, when we come up with them, we test them specifically to see if they're what we call sticky or memorable, so that they can pass easily from person to person. That's part of how they work, with repetition and wide dissemination. So they can be easily adopted by non-experts. Toxic stress wasn't a term in use 15 years ago. If you go back to data analytics or Google searches from 15 years ago, you wouldn't see it. But now it's a term that's regularly used in American media to explain the neurobiological effects of chronic, unrelenting trauma on developing brains. And really importantly, what that has done is introduce millions of people to concepts of brain development and the science of it that they never would have had access to otherwise. Nobody knows what allostatic load means unless they work in the field. Sounds like something to do with laundry to those of us who are not neuroscientists, okay? But toxic stress, we can understand. It's toxic is bad, so we can get that. There's still a lot of work to be done, as you well know if you've watched any news stories coming out of the US right now. So there's a long way to go, but there's a lot of evidence too that this public awareness that has come from the changing discourse is resulting in shifts in thinking that we couldn't have imagined happening 20 years ago. So here's just a quick example of that. These are two surveys, well-designed, random sample, appropriate parent samples, checked for language to minimize major biases and so on. So well-done surveys, done 9 years apart, that indicate a significant change over a 9-year course in how people think about issues around young children, especially things like public understanding about how preverbal children communicate stress to their parents. So it's a big leap. These two surveys were actually done in Canada, where we also tested the term toxic stress, and it's now been in use for a long time as well. So one was a national survey, one was a provincial survey in Ontario. So they're not, I don't want to mislead you into thinking they're one-to-one comparisons, but they do suggest that the overall efforts of the field to change the way they're thinking and talking, the way they're talking to the public, is having effects on public understanding. And finally, that shift in public awareness is yielding concrete, tangible gains in social policy for children. So here are just a couple of examples. The California Senate recently adopted legislation to investigate ways to mitigate the effects of toxic stress. They use the language of toxic stress in the legislature. It's informed how people think about the issue. And then we've just in the last couple of years have been working with the state of Tennessee on what they call the Building Strong Brains Initiative. That's another one of our metaphors, brain architecture, to talk about how kids' brains develop. And that's a conservative government, and they've invested a lot of money into doing work with the public to expand people's awareness of adverse childhood experiences and what to do to combat toxic stress. Okay, so that's partly the result of a shifting discourse and shifting public thinking. So the critical piece to remember about strategic framing is in the idea of movement building. This isn't about branding a nonprofit or giving you a tagline that you can use for a few months before you get bored and discard it for something else, which is one way to approach communications, but it's not the way to approach movement building. Instead, it's really about getting an entire field of practice to share the same story in order to amplify that story loud enough and widely enough to bring the whole public along in your work to displace less helpful stories, to change the way your entire culture, your society thinks about the issue, so that everywhere the public goes, they encounter expert and advocate messages that they remember, that are familiar because they've heard it somewhere else before. So this is one strategy. Everybody tells their own story, and then the public catches whatever it catches when it comes by some information. Or alternatively, you all head in the same direction. You don't have to tell the exact same story, but if you share the same framing strategies, you really can move people, in part because the repetition of the work that you're doing can drown out the other stories that are less helpful. I'll spend the rest of my time talking about 3 key parts of framing. But before I do that, I said we do research, so I thought it'd be appropriate for us to simulate an experiment on you. You all signed your waivers, right? No, that wasn't a joke. No, actually, it was a joke. Okay, so what I want to do is simulate an experiment that was first done by 2 psychologists named Hyder and Simmel back in 1944. And Hyder and Simmel were interested in figuring out how people come to make judgments of others. So they ran this experiment. We're going to simulate it here. It's a short 90-second video. There's no sound. I just want you to watch the video, and then we'll talk about your response to it. Just see what you see, and we'll talk about it. So raise your hand if you saw a story as you watched that video. Okay. Congratulations, you are all normal. No, I'm kidding. I have no idea if you're normal or not. But just like the subjects in the original study, you saw a story unfold. Anyone want to share the story that you saw? Yes, go ahead. Wow, that's amazing. Okay, so if you didn't hear it, it was a post-World War II story of fascism and the bully being destroyed by the Allies who had banded together, right? It was amazing. Okay, and any other story? Yes. That was a brilliant summary of what we saw. So it was a story of bullying. It was a story of loneliness. It was high drama. And we saw the characters moving around. One more. Way in the back. Oh, yes. Okay, a story of being imprisoned and then the impact that prison has on you. That's amazing. Okay, so one of the interesting things is that the stories often repeat themselves, but every now and then I hear one that I haven't heard before. So I haven't heard the prison story before. I once delivered this to a labor management conference, and I got a Marxist analysis from the labor side of labor and capital, which was fantastic. But here's the thing. What we really saw on the screen was a bunch of shapes moving around, right? Two-dimensional shapes. But okay, the box looks like a house and there's a line, and that looked like a door, so that's fine. But then we took it many steps further and attributed motive. We had maybe age. We had sometimes I hear gender. So we had a lot going on in that story of two-dimensional shapes on a field. Okay, so the lesson there really is that there's a story there, whether or not you're telling it. The thing to know about communication is that our brains think in story. And so if you don't tell a story that fills in all of the holes for your audience, they're going to fill in those holes for themselves, and you have no idea what they're going to come up with. One time I heard a rendition of the story that was about the big Dorito and the little Dorito. So all kinds of things can happen when our brains are left to their own devices. So there's a story there, and it's your job as a communicator to tell it, because if you don't tell it, your audience will tell it for you, and it may not be the story that you want told. So framing fundamental 1 is that effective stories leave nothing to chance. What that means for you as communicators is that even though you know that stories are powerful, it's not enough to just tell a story. You have to ask, what will that story do? So that's where you start with framing. What's the effect of this story going to be on my audience? Framing fundamental 2 is that culture complicates communications and makes things a lot harder than we would like them to be, perhaps. So that leads to a problem at frameworks that we call the you say, they think problem. I'm guessing you're familiar with this, which is where you, the expert, say something that sounds totally logical and clear and innocuous, but somehow the public doesn't quite get that message. They walk around with a very different understanding of the issue in their heads. So you might say something like, social determinants largely explain why some groups are less healthy than others. But here's what you hear when you talk with the public.
Well, personal choices.
Personal choice. The choices they make.
Negligence, mostly.
Just not treating your body like a temple.
Some people just don't care about their health.
Health is something that you have to be accountable to yourself for.
And then you end up kind of scratching your head saying, where did I go wrong? Did I not say social determinants? Why isn't that getting through? Or another example, you might say something like this: persistent stress can derail development and have negative long-term effects on health and well-being, but somehow this is the public's takeaway.
Life's hard. It's supposed to be hard. You know, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. All the bad cliches you can think of. I mean, there's been people that have come from absolutely nothing to make it in whatever society's eyes deems success.
Yes, it doesn't take too many times of this happening to you before you start to realize something's going on here. And the thing that's going on here is that culture gets in the way of those communications, because in the absence of expert understanding of an issue, we turn to what information we have, and that information comes from a lifetime of living in a culture, accruing assumptions and beliefs from the stories that we tell each other, from the stories that show up in our books and our movies and our news media, that we tell each other at work, at home, the stories of our lives. And those form assumptions and expectations about how the world works that are taken for granted. They're automatic assumptions, and when we don't have expert understanding to use to interpret a message, we turn to those assumptions instead to make quick work of incoming information. It's our brain's way of being efficient in the face of an overwhelming amount of information and stimulation that comes at us. So the thing about culture models, if you can understand what cultural models, what assumptions drive your audience's way of thinking about an issue, then you have an advantage in talking with people. It's important to understand that there are multiple models available for any social issue. So on the one hand, I can think that health is all about individualism, and at the same time, it's possible for me to understand that environments affect health. It's just that one of those models is usually stronger than the other. So if you think of them as muscles, maybe I exercise the individual muscle a lot more than I exercise the collective environments matter muscle. And so your job as a communicator is to pull forward the productive models, to exercise this mental muscle in your audience as much as possible, so that over time it becomes the stronger, the more dominant assumption they turn to for making sense of your issue. So this is an optical illusion you might be familiar with. And this is kind of an example of how framing works. A strategic framer chooses cues that make it easier for non-experts to see what you want them to see. So maybe the first thing you saw when I clicked over to this slide was a woman in profile. Here's her nose, here's her mouth, here's her chin, looking kind of towards you. But what I want you to do is see the younger woman who's here. There's her hair, there's the line of her face, a little bit of her nose and eyelash, her jawline here, her ear, right? So that's how strategic framing works. People have multiple ways of seeing something, but you just have to pull forward the image that you want them to see, or the idea you want them to see. And if you saw that older woman in profile, but I told you it's actually a woman with her face turned away from the camera, you would work harder to see the woman with her face turned away from the camera. And the same is true in reverse. One other note about culture informing framing, it's that it keeps framing from being one size fits all. So I'll give you a quick example of that. In the US, a value that works really well, that we've tested multiple times, for talking about child well-being is the idea of prosperity. I come from a place where everything is a commodity. We are a hyper-capitalist society. I'm not proud of that fact. That's just how it is. And so a message of prosperity works really well with the American public to help them think about children's issues. We did that research, and then we were invited to Canada to do similar research. So we went there and we said, well, prosperity worked in the US, let's see what happens in Canada. Well, our neighbors to the north were horrified that you would think about children as a commodity. So what worked instead for them is a value of interdependence, the idea that we need to ensure all children's healthy development because what affects one affects all of us. And then we went and did similar work in the UK and found a different value that worked there, which is social responsibility, the idea that if we take responsibility as a society, we can help children develop positively and promote their future well-being. Those are all three different ways of approaching the issue. And culturally, each one of those works on the target audience to move people's support for issues. So culture complicates communications. And then the final framing fundamental I want to share with you is that framing really is an empirical question. Which frame works best is something you can test through research. And it starts by understanding that our brains are just not as logical as we would like to believe they are. So if you're here earlier today, you heard Jess Berenson-Shaw talk about using myths and trying to avoid repeating things that you don't believe. Well, there's a study that was done a few years ago, and it's been replicated since then, in the US, where a team of researchers took a flyer put out by the Centers for Disease Control in the US, a flyer about the flu shot and how important the flu shot was. And it was organized with myth-fact order, so you can't read it from the back room, but it says the flu isn't myth. The flu isn't a serious disease. Fact, the flu is a serious disease. Myth, the flu shot can cause the flu. Fact, the flu shot cannot cause the flu. So people read this flyer and then were asked a series of questions about what they had read, and this is what the researchers found. People misremember the myths as true. Their memory got worse over time. They brought them back 3 weeks later and found out that they misremembered more of the myths as true. And then maybe worst of all, they attributed the false information to the CDC. So now they had a bunch of people walking around saying, the CDC says I don't have to get a flu shot because it's not a serious disease. Okay. So the thing to take away from this is that our brains work in such a way that it's actually easier to alter facts to fit the pre-existing frame that we have in our heads, or the pre-existing belief, than it is to alter the pre-existing belief to accommodate new facts, which is terrifying, but that's how our brains work. So it's critical to not repeat what you don't want people to remember. Okay, if you don't believe it, don't repeat it is an excellent communication strategy. Daniel Kahneman, he's a Nobel-winning economist, talks about this phenomena in a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, and it's an interesting book because he talks about our brain. He creates two characters, these sort of warring protagonists, System 1 and System 2. And System 1 is this sort of like quick, fast, frugal processor of information, and that's where all of our cultural models come in. It's the part of our brain that leaps up quickly to process information as quickly as possible by pulling bits of whatever's familiar in a message and gluing it together to make some kind of meaning out of it, however wrong that meaning might be. And then System 2 is slower, more thoughtful, but it often doesn't get a chance to work because System 1 jumps into play immediately. Okay, so framing gives you an opportunity to get System 2 to work by putting cues. The idea of framing is to put cues into your message that surprise System 1 into silence, so that System 2 has a chance to do something. If you don't put cues in your message that are familiar, that remind people of their assumptions, then they're more likely to slow down and have to process the information because they have been surprised into not recognizing anything that you're sharing with them. Oh, I didn't realize I hadn't clicked there. Yes, so System 1 and System 2. Okay. The next thing to know about framing is that it can be counterintuitive. So remember, the idea here is to not say the familiar things and activate the unhelpful cultural models that people have. You want to help them think more productively, but sometimes that means doing things that every ounce of your being tell you can't be right. Okay? And that's how research comes into play. So I'm going to give you an example of that. We did some work, you saw a clip of it earlier, with advocates working in Alberta, Canada on substance use issues. And they came to us and wanted help because they'd been working for years to build public support for public funding, better interventions and treatment options for people with substance use disorder. At the time, the word addiction was being used, but this was only a few years ago, but the field is changing so fast that's fallen out of favor. So we said, okay, we'll do some work with you, but let's take a look at your communications and see what kinds of framing strategies you're using that you're not really getting the return that you want. And what we found is that 90% of their communications appealed to the value of empathy. So we said, well, let's test empathy, and we'll test some other possibilities too. So we tested the value of interdependence, the idea that what happens to you affects me and what happens to me affects you. We tested the value of ingenuity, the idea that we are a creative, resourceful people. We've solved tough problems before, we can do it again. And we tested the value of empathy, the idea that, what if it were your loved one? What if it were you? Wouldn't you want these supports available to you? This is what we found. So we found that interdependence worked really well to move people's support for the policies the activists and advocates wanted to move support for. Ingenuity worked too, not as well, but it worked pretty well. But this was the most startling and scariest finding, which is that empathy not only didn't build people's support, it actually depressed people's support for the very policies the advocates wanted to move on. And remember, 90% of their communications were using an appeal to the value of empathy. But they weren't getting any traction with it. They were actually depressing people's support. And one theory that we have, and I should say that sometimes we can tell you that a framing strategy works, but we can't always tell you why it works or why it doesn't work. But our theory here is that these two are very collective values. This is about uniting people as a community to move on an issue. Empathy is not collective. Empathy is very individualizing because what you're asking people to do is step into the shoes of another person. If the shoes of the person you're asking them to step into happen to be the shoes of someone with a substance use disorder in this instance, then what people tend to do is back away and say, no, I can't imagine myself in those shoes because I would never make those choices. I would never be that person. So I don't have to imagine myself in those shoes because that wouldn't be me. That person should have done something different. So empathy really depresses support for policy level solutions that are collective and community oriented. So in order to figure out what works, you really have to do the work of some research and kind of walk yourself through a series of questions. And here's a series of questions that we walk ourselves through every time we take on a framing project at Frameworks. We start with what needs to be communicated. We go to experts to find that out. And then we ask ourselves, how does the public think? We go to the public and find that out through long form interviews that we transcribe and code, and through on the street interviews. And then we do a media analysis to see what framing strategies are already out there, what stories are already dominant. Now we move to this prescriptive research to find out, to sit down and think about what reframes are plausible. We have a tool that we call the Metaphor Sandbox, which is actually, it's just a Google Doc, but if you say Metaphor Sandbox, it sounds a lot more fun. And it is a lot of fun to play in there, come up with all kinds of strategies and hypotheses that we can test. Once we've got a good list, we take them on the streets to see which ones are plausible. Once we've seen which ones seem plausible from our on the street testing of them, you saw some clips of that earlier, we move on to controlled experiments, which are large scale online survey experiments. And then finally, anything that succeeds here goes on to persistence trials, which is generational testing to make sure that a strategy can pass from person to person without falling apart. That's where we're testing for stickiness. And then if it works there, that's when we say we have a recommended framing strategy. So to sum up, effective framing is about knowing what you're up against in your own culture, in the dominant culture. What stories reign? What stories are obstacles to your moving people along with you for the ride, for the agenda that you're pursuing? And then using empirically vetted strategies to navigate around those obstacles, however you can. I want to leave you with one more quote. This is from Dr. King, letter from a Birmingham jail. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. And even in a moment in my home where politics are as divisive as I've ever seen them, I still think this is true. So, and the best news is that framing is something that can help you move those people of goodwill to better understand your issue and become some of your strongest allies. I want to thank you for your time, and if we have time, I'm happy to take any questions.